Hi, can we hear me? If you just comment in the chat, say hello. Hi, Louise. How are you doing? Okay, can you hear me at all, Louis? Fabulous. Okay, cool. We'll get started. I think we've got a few people joining us, but they're a bit late, but we'll get started. Before I get started, could you just let me know if you've done an essay before? So do you have any experience with writing synoptic essays at all? Perfect. Okay, cool. So what I will do is I'll go through how the essay should be structured, and then in a session later, what I'm going to do is do the predicted ones that we've got predicted for this year. You can easily predict them, but once you learn one, then you learn all the others as well. So I'm going to go through how they are marked, but also like what to think about when you're writing. What grade do you want to get? What are you aiming for? Fantastic. Okay, cool. So I will for A star, I'll go through which marks you should get in the essays that will really help you secure that A star as well. So you should be seeing my screen just now come up with my PowerPoint. There's a slight delay. It's about a 5-second delay. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is just talk you through what the essay is and like what examiners are looking for. So it's 25 marks. It's found in paper 3. You need to it's allocated 40 minutes, but if you are secure on your paper 3 content, so paper 3 is mostly practicals. So if you're secure on your practical content and your synoptic content, then you can actually spend quite a lot of time on the essay. I would advise that as soon as you walk into the exam for the paper 3, have a look at the essay titles, because you might find that it's an essay you've done before. So which means you can actually start with it instead of doing the rest of the paper. But that's a decision you'll have to make once you do quite a few. And then there will always be 2 questions and you get to choose one. Just be careful that you don't waste too much time on one title, then decide to change your question. So before you start to write either of them, really decide, like, do you have an idea what you want to write about, so that you don't waste too much time. And then the main important thing about essays is that, number one, it's about depth and breadth. So if you're aiming for an A star, you really need to be using those really high biology terms in every single essay that you write. And I would say if you start now practicing your essays, your knowledge, your terminology really develops over time. It's actually quite enjoyable. You end up really enjoying essays. And the good thing about the essay is that it always helps your main content as well. And it helps you know where your biology is a bit weak, so you can actually work with that as well. All the questions now, since I think 2016, have the word importance or role, because they got feedback that students were not sure what the question was asking. So then they now all start with importance or role, which means that every single paragraph you write has to be linked to an application. And then the questions are quite, sometimes you can miss part of the question. So it will say importance of something, and then it uses in and between. So importance of transport in and between cells, that sort of thing. So you need to really read the question and check that you're answering both parts of the question before you start as well. Now, I'm going to show you like a method of answering essay questions, so just structuring them. And then later on, we're going to actually focus on specific essays which could come up, because we've looked at all the essays that have come up so far. And so the ones that are more likely to come up as well. But technically, if you apply this method to any essay title, you should be all right as long as your knowledge is secure. So 10 marks is AO1, which is just the content. So you're describing processes, that is AO1, and or you can only get maximum 10 marks. And then 15 marks, sorry, and then 10 marks is application. So for every process you write, you need to say why it's important, because that's in the title of the question. If you don't say why it's important, then you can't get the mark. So you need to make sure you're saying why something is important. So gas exchange, why is it important for that organism, whilst you're giving examples of the organisms as well throughout. Do you have any questions before I move on? So I give you just some more structure details on the next slide. Not yet. Perfect. Just honestly, I can see your chat, so just put a question in the chat and I'll be able, and if I'm going too fast, just let me know. So, because you're aiming for an A star, aim for an essay that is in the relational band. There's several bands. Basically, what examiners do is they read through your whole essay, and before they even start marking it, they put it into a band. Most students in the country get the multi-structural one, but students who get an A star get the relational or extended abstract. What I would advise you is start with multi-structural, get 15 marks, then know what you need to do to move it to relational. And then once that's secure, then you can move it to extended abstract. Because to write an extended abstract, everything else in the relational and multi-structure has to be ticked. So there's a grid. So have you ever seen like a paper 3? Have you downloaded any paper 3s at all? So if you look at the mark scheme for the essay, it's the problem with it is that it's really difficult to mark yourself, which is where understanding which band you fall into becomes difficult. So you will see these bands. So what I've done is just taken the multi-structure because I don't think students should aim for less than that. So if you write a multi-structural essay, most of your first essays will fall in this category because you're more likely to like waffle on because you're like, oh, I'll just write about this, then I'll write about this, then I'll write about that. And you'll forget to then check for the interrelatedness of the topic. And you'll forget to check for links. And then sometimes, particularly with topics like gas exchange, students just write so much GCSE, and that doesn't actually get you any marks at all. You may have clear explanations, you may have good terminology, but making it interlinked and making sure all the content you're writing is A level moves your essay to then become a relational. So for a relational one, you've got several topics, and I'll give you an idea how many topics you should always include. And then you need to make sure that all the content is at A level, like absolutely all of it. None of it should be at GCSE. So my advice would be look through every module that you've done so far. What is the GCSE content? What is the A level content? So if I'm talking about gas exchange, words like diffusion, yes, absolutely fine. But at A level, we look at facilitated diffusion, we look at core transport, we look at using carrier proteins, channel proteins. You need to mention that extra detail as well. So just have a look at the difference between these two bands. Now, once you've done all the relational, really, ideally, you then think, okay, what have I read about this in like a journal that you've read or in the synoptic parts of the textbook? And then once you do that, that would move your essay from a relational to an extended abstract. But I would say secure these. If you can get 20 marks in an essay, you are in the top 2% in the country. A lot of students don't get up to 15. Does that all make sense? Fabulous. Okay, now you have access to this PowerPoint, so don't worry too much about making too many notes. You will have access to this. So when you're looking at how you structure the essay, so let's ignore the science, just how you structure the essay. What I would always recommend, you've got enough time to write a plan, because in an exam conditions, what you will end up doing is you'll be under quite a bit of stress. So therefore, you may forget to talk about something. Whereas if you have a plan and you have like, okay, so I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to go to this and that, you can logically arrange your arguments and you can use it as a tick list. And what examiners have said is students who always included a plan in their essay wrote more linked arguments. So a plan is absolutely important. And I'll show you a framework of how to do the plan as well. Now, the bare minimum is that you need 5 topics. 4 is fine, but if you use 4 topics, then you need to make sure most of them are year two topics. So if you end up, let's say you're writing an essay on, I don't know, bonding, and all you do is write about water, that's year one. In fact, that's like biological molecules, that's the first topic. So what you end up is getting very low marks because you're not mentioning enough year two content. Because the good thing about the AQA biology course, it builds up over time. So your year two content is so vital for your essay as well. So 5 topics is a good go to have, and divide it into 10 paragraphs. So 5 topics, and underneath each topic, you've got an AO1 paragraph and an AO2. If you decide that 10 paragraphs is too much, you can do 5 paragraphs, but make sure there's AO1 and there's AO2. So you really need to check your paragraphs time and again, which is why I'm saying if you're aiming for an A star, secure your knowledge. Like paper 1 and paper 2 should be a walk in the park in your exams so that you can focus on paper 3 and the practice of paper 3 as well. Make sure they're all linked, so don't start and stop. So there has to be a common theme throughout. So use comparative statements. Make sure, like, if you have your plan, you logically arrange them. So if I'm talking about cells, for instance, or linked to organisms, I talk about simple cells, then I move on to something slightly more complex, but not as complex, then build up. So you're building like the levels of organization, if that makes sense, because everything should be linked from the start to the finish. The essay should read like a story, and it's linked all throughout as well. So just have a read through that and then let me know if you have any questions. So you don't actually need to link in like the journal link at all. You link in the story. So for instance, let's say I'm writing about importance of transport. I could link in the role that mutations play in transport in a negative and a positive way. Then I could link in something I've read maybe about cystic fibrosis, because like cystic fibrosis is not a topic in your spec as such. So if you include an example like cystic fibrosis, it means you've read beyond the spec. And like if you read about cystic fibrosis, you read about like the lack of transport, depending on what type of cystic fibrosis it is, like the lack of transport of chloride ions and how that affects action potentials and things like that, and the buildup of mucus. So they're not actually asking you to link like, oh, in Nature this was published or anything like that. It's just the knowledge part of it. And they will check it for the accuracy of the science as well. Does that make sense? Yes, definitely. So I would always say, I always say to students, I send my students like stories I see. So at the end of this, I'll show you like where you can go. But I always say to students, so what? So you're learning about biological molecules. Where does that apply in the real world? And then what would happen if it didn't work? So you're always telling the story and you're thinking of both sides of the arguments. One thing I've noticed with year 13s when they write about essays, there's so much focus on humans because that's the part that relates to them, but they don't think, hang on, pathogens are organisms as well. So you could argue on the context of the pathogen being successful because that's an evolutionary trait. So you could link in COVID, HIV, that sort of thing, and you're arguing on the side of the pathogen, and then you argue on the side of the human as well, and you're saying how it negatively impacts humans as well. Does that make sense? Fabulous. Okay, now one last point, and this has come from the essays I've marked. A lot of my students were writing because they do English as well and psychology. They were writing and they were doing headings. So for them to decide 5 topics, they were writing headings like gas exchange in lungs and gas exchange in mammals and things like that. And the problem with that is that it stops the flow. So I would avoid headings and just write about the next thing really smoothly and it all links in. Because if you have headings, then the person that's marking has to look at the heading, then go back to the heading, and after they read the paragraph, they're like, oh, okay, so is this related to the heading? Whereas if you write a good essay, you can talk about multiple organisms and multiple topics, like super linked. Like if you're talking about respiration, you also talk about photosynthesis as well. So I would have always avoid headings as well in your essays. It just doesn't read well. It's very difficult to look for links if you've got headings in your essay as well. So here's an essay that was written by one of my students. I've asked them for permission as well. And I just want you to scan through it. And then in the chat, what do you think? Do you think they've covered, this is like, I think half of the essay. So what have they focused on? Can you see it fine? Can you zoom in? Fabulous. So I'll just pause for a couple of minutes. As an idea comes to you, put it in the chat. I won't say anything until you're done, but just read through it. What are the main errors they've made? What would you do to improve it? So the essay was importance of gas exchange. Yes, I agree with you. Um, they've described the process for quite a long time, and one thing they've forgotten is that the person marking is an expert. So if I'm marking this, I know how countercurrent exchange happens, but they've said there's a sentence here which says countercurrent exchange is widely spread amongst fish. It allows for more oxygen to be picked up. That's where they should have said why that's important. So they should have really expanded on what they meant by that and what would happen if countercurrent exchange system didn't occur. But they've described the process in too much detail as well. Is there anything else you've picked up So how would you like start the essay? Would you start the essay the same way? It is quite vague. In fact, it reads a bit like a book, doesn't it? It reads like I would say it reads a bit like the story is this question is about evolution of gas exchange systems. It's a bit more a history essay than it is a science essay. So what I've said is you don't need an introduction, just go into the topic and start writing about the topic. So technically they could have, the last part is where they should have started. They should have just started about gas exchange in fish as an example, or simple organisms. Um, it's just, yes, the story is interesting, but does it really answer the question? So I've said it's not linked to questions. So effectively, I would negatively mark this, and they would have already lost about 7 to 10 marks, and they would have already put themselves into the multi-structural category. So on the lower end, so they would be, for me, if I carried on reading, I wouldn't give them higher than 11 already. So that the essay has to be so succinct and avoid stories that too early on. So they focus too much on the beyond the A level instead of starting by telling me the knowledge, if that makes sense. So what I would advise, which is, so I've taken the same essay and just done firstly a plan for it. So this is my advice as to how you should plan your essay. So here's the question. Now I've made the question one parted. So I've discussed the importance of gas exchange in organisms. This is more likely to be discussed the importance of gas exchange in and between organisms. So I've just done the in organisms part, not between organisms, because we could then link two animals together or two organisms together if we went between organisms. So this is just an example. You would come up with a lot more ideas. Just roughly, this is what we would be looking for. So we would be looking for you to mention something to do with single-celled organisms like amoeba. Now, if you mentioned amoeba are not actually in your spec, so you're already doing something beyond the spec, but starting with a single-celled organism makes sense because you're developing more complexity. And then you would then go on and talk about something in your spec like fish. Lugworms are a very important part of your spec. Then obviously you talk about lungs and alveoli. And then plants is a really important one because then you can link in the between part. So gas exchange is important in plants. Why is that important? Well, it links to animals as well, because plants give us the glucose that we need for respiration as well. So then what is the knowledge? So the knowledge is where most students get what the knowledge is. The application is where they fail to make the links. Okay. Now, if I show you all the knowledge bits, if you look at the application part, you'll notice there's overlap. So if you're saying gas exchange is important for respiration, that's GCSE. You have to say which gas is important for which part of respiration. So oxygen is an electron acceptor, so proton acceptor at the end of the ETC, because without it, the ETC would not complete. And remember that the ETC is sort of the longest part of respiration. So you want to make sure that you've mentioned that. And then link in why surface area to volume ratio affects that gas exchange, what would happen if it didn't, linking other uses of gas exchange and other uses of respiration, linking diseases. You could talk about emphysema and what happens when people's lungs are clogged. You could talk about what would happen if lugworms didn't survive on the rock surface side, if they like shallow areas of water, why that's good, what would happen if they went into the deeper parts of the sea or the ocean, that sort of thing. So you can really write a detailed essay that links in organisms, but also talks about really key processes in biology. So have a read through this. Is there anything else you would include? Is there any process you don't agree with? What would you change it to? That sort of thing. What key terminology would you use that I haven't used? That just look at it and see if you can improve it as well. Yes. So the reason I've put it in each part so that you know that you could talk about the ETC all throughout. So for instance, if I mention ETC, I'm not using the concepts as single concepts, and I could be talking about all of them at once. So if I said gas exchange is important as it provides oxygen for respiration, then I would describe the ETC process, and then I would talk about ETC and maybe its differences, which would be beyond the spec in fish compared to humans, compared to single-celled organisms, which organism needs the electron transport chain more. So as long as you've mentioned it in a general context across, yes, you don't need to repeat it at all. If you did repeat a paragraph about the ETC, as long as it's not the same information, so you could go in more detail in one paragraph compared to the other. So as long as it's not the same information, that's absolutely fine as well. So what modules are you doing at the moment? Because there's a lot of links to respiration later on in the spec. Okay, good. So which part? So are you doing neuronal communication or hormonal? Okay, so if we think about it, you could include for homeostasis, you could include muscle contraction and why it needs. So gas exchange is important because muscles need ATP, and then you say what they need ATP for. So when you're looking at the tropomyosin and the slide filament theory mechanism, so you could link in that as well. So you could have a whole section just focusing on the role of ATP in different reactions. You could have a whole section of the role of ATP in certain cascades in homeostasis as well. Yes, yes. because you've started with the gas exchange bit and you've just applied it. So you there you go. So ATP is generated from the ETC. Without ATP being generated, then there wouldn't be as much ATP available for muscle contraction. And if there's not enough ATP available for muscle contraction, you could link in cardiac cycle. That's a good link. Yeah, it's one of those things where like the ideas come to you the more you practice. I always start by doing like a plan, and then I write anything that is like very linked, like the most closely linked thing. So here ETC is the most closely linked, but then I go, okay, so what? And then I expand with a different color pen and that sort of thing. It's very beautiful to write, but I would say this is a good time to start writing essays, because once you finish homeostasis, the next one would be, do you have two or one teacher? Because so the other teacher should be doing genetics, if I'm right, or topic 8, so 7 or 8. Perfect. So one of the most important, so I always say to students, topic 8 is the most important topic of the course because it sums up the course. It talks about gene technologies. So if once your knowledge is secure for this essay, you could then link in a gene technology, but you would have had to finish the spec for you to be able to do that. In the sense that you could have read an article about something scientists are doing to increase respiration and to increase gas exchange systems efficacy. So you could look at how scientists offer therapy for people with cystic fibrosis and what inhalers do and things like that. Because inhalers will open airways up, won't they? And that will maximize the exchange surface as well, which will make more efficient gas exchange, which will make it even more applicable as well. Okay, so the next bit that I wanted to do is just general advice when you're writing essays, and I think I've mentioned most of this already. Um, you're given 40 minutes. I've said if your knowledge is secure, and you only know your knowledge is secure if you're doing a lot of paper 3. The students that have got A stars are the students that have done every paper that exists out there. Your teachers have got access to Exam Pro, and Exam Pro has got like 10,000 questions. Once you've done all the past papers, they can generate a lot more questions. They can make a synoptic essay pack on Exam Pro. There's 45 essay questions currently available, and they do repeat. So I would really invest in doing as many essays as possible because it also improves your actual knowledge. Please don't think you're bad at essays at the beginning. Everybody's bad at essays because they write simply, and so you might get lower marks at the beginning, but the feedback is important. And I would always go and see your teachers and ask them how you can improve your essay as well. We at Easter will do a session where you can actually send some essays in, and I can mark them and give you feedback and things like that. So look for ways of actually improving your essays as opposed to focusing on too much beyond the A-level content. I've talked about reading. I use on Instagram, if you're on social media, on Instagram, I have subscribed to Popular Science and Microbiology Today. And interestingly, Bins and Guardian Science, they release all these Insta shots that they don't release as articles, so you have to go to their website to then find the article, and they're really, really good, and they're very applicable as well. They just really improve your knowledge and give you a lot of application as well. And like I said, don't focus on beyond the spec until you're secure. And in your textbook, if you've got the chunky textbook for AQA, it's got synoptic sections as well. So just look at those after you've practiced a few essays, to see where you can improve your knowledge on that. More importantly, if you make a significant error, that loses you marks. So check your science, check that but this is also a literacy point. So we don't produce energy, we release energy. So the science has to be right. However, if you've made a couple of mistakes, that doesn't really matter. Markers could always read the context. It's when there's significant errors. If you've described a process completely wrong, then you will lose quite a lot of marks for that. It just moves you down a band as well. Okay, is there any questions on the general advice at all? No, good. In terms of what to avoid, so GCSE content I've made clear, you avoid that. Then some of my students are always ending each section with, if this didn't happen, the organism would die. What does that mean? Which process is affected? Which protein is affected? Always do the specifics, because that doesn't carry any marks at all. I've talked about significant errors, abbreviations. So in your spec, if you download your spec, you can see for each module what abbreviations are allowed, and those you can use. So for instance, you can write DNA, but it has to be capital letters. If you wrote DNA and RNA as lowercase letters, you would lose marks for that because it's an acronym. So make sure you check the spec. You're not allowed to use abbreviations, just use the ones only in the spec. And then what I've said is start practicing your essays now, because if you start practicing your essays now, you will get more and more confident. It improves your general knowledge as well, your general biology knowledge, and it will actually improve the way you answer exam questions as well. And then avoid going beyond the spec until you're absolutely confident and sure that you're ready to go beyond the spec as well. So my year 13s at the moment, because we've been practicing essays for a while now, they do an essay a week. You could do an essay every fortnight. And check with your teachers. I don't think there'll be teachers that will say no to mark your essays. They're quite happy to mark essays. Just ask them as well, and they'll be quite happy to help you as well. And then Primrose Kitten have actually got an essay book that you can download. And what I always say is look at the spec and look at all the modules that you've covered. What is the importance of each concept? What's the A-level knowledge? What's the GCSE? And then research, like do all the ones in the papers. And I've also suggested that your teachers could generate extra essay questions as well, that are the AQA ones. The ones before 2016 are fine to practice from, but just remember that they don't have the word importance in them, whereas all the essays for your spec have the word importance. So you can change the older ones and just imagine they're asking for importance, because that's now like a standard thing that they have. Okay, so this is everything that I had for you. So we've still got about 8 minutes. If you have any questions. Yes, yes, that's absolutely, that would be a very well linked um, essay. And remember that four is fine if you do it well as well. So when you look at the Primrose Kitten essay one, they give you one that would be marked same title, one that would be marked with a lower mark, one that would be like medium and multi-structural, and then one that will be extended abstract. So you can sort of see the style of writing. Okay, are you joining the session later? Because the session later is just focusing on the science part, but I've covered quite most of it already with you. So are you here later? Because what I'll do is I'll look at what the basic knowledge is and what for the ones that are predicted. Yeah, so I will. I'm recording this one anyway, so I will record that one as well on the predicted ones, and you can access it from the website as well. And you can get a copy of the PowerPoints as well. They send them like a couple of days later. You just have to email Emily and ask for them. Fantastic. If do you have any more questions before I end the session? Fabulous. Well, hopefully that was useful and it's given you a bit of an idea about the structure of the essay. There'll be more sessions at Easter as well, if you want to join those. And you can even send in topics that we can cover, but that usually comes after you finish the spec as well. So have a lovely rest of the half term if you're on half term, and enjoy your day. Fabulous. Thank you.